Hey guys, coming at you with another little bit of encouragement, hopefully before you guys get together with your discipleship teams today. We're going to be covering question 10 and 11 in this video, and I hope it just encourages you and equips you for some good conversation with them. So question 10 is, did the first humans worship God like they were supposed to? Obviously the answer to that is no. They sinned against God by worshiping idols rather than bearing the image of the one who created them. Adam and Eve, in short, took the bait. So they were tempted by Satan, and this is a great opportunity to enter in the topic of Satan, or the conversation about him, and to be able to learn about it, because the whole book doesn't really capture much of it. So some good verses, thank you for pulling them out for us, Carrie, were 2 Corinthians 11:13 through 15, 2 Timothy 2:26, 1 Peter 5-8 are the ones that I think would be most constructive of it. I don't think there's any doubt, if you look at the state of the world, that Satan exists. And I don't want to spend the entire time for you guys talking about Satan specifically on this, but I do think it's very important for you guys to address the fact that Satan is real and that he is scheming every possible way he can to get us to take the bait and fall away from the will of God, just as Adam and Eve did. Adam and Eve fell for an idol, and that idol wasn't a graven image, like we often have this because it's portrayed that way largely in the Old Testament. We see Baal and Magog and so many different idols that they fall for and they start worshiping. But we also see an idol in this aspect of the knowledge of good and evil, being like God. It's not always a noun, if you would, but sometimes it's this concept, it's an idea that pulls people out. And I think that's one where we relate to a lot in our culture. And the youth would really grasp that and I think connect with it. But I also don't want to run away from the fact of they have real idols. Ask them how many of them would freak out and be in utter fear if they took their phones away for a week, or if they were unable to play a sport. Those things can very easily become idols, and I want to talk about that and flesh that out a little bit with them. We see up here in the top right, the root of the first temptation was to push Adam and Eve to doubt God's plan for their lives. Did you know anything you trust or fear more than God becomes something you worship? Now that statement might and probably will catch most of them off guard, because they wouldn't necessarily have given it that definition. But I think as we process it and as we learn from this idea, that we see if we are fearing something or trusting something more than obeying what God tells us to, well, we can only cater to one of those. So we're either giving into our own understanding, in our own fear, in our own trust, or we are relying solely upon what the Lord has taught us and led us to. So I think that can be a good conversation to flesh out some of them and where their fears and where their hopes and their trust are, and ask them, what's easier to trust about the Lord? What's harder to trust about the Lord? The next question is, what kind of things do you see being worshipped in society today? That could be a whole list of things: pride, self-centeredness, greed, gluttony, love of possessions, sexuality, all these different things that could be idolized. At this point, I would encourage you to challenge them to go a little bit deeper and personal and say, what of these stands out to you in your life? How does the enemy bait you into trying to follow after him? What comes up in that? And encourage them to speak out. Don't force them by any means, but remind them that the more they stay silent about the struggles that they face, the more power it gives to that struggle. And so to be real, because we all struggle with it, and state that to them very clearly. We all struggle with different sins here. So to be able to talk about them only gives us strength and comfort in being able to deal with them as a community. The last verse it leads us to is in Romans 1:21. It says, yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks, and then began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Well, that sounds a lot like our culture today. I think that's something to talk about, how sin is ever present and man will always choose to return to darkness when they stray away from the teachings of God. And so we see this as a habitual pattern throughout all of Scripture, where people just come up with creative ways to sin and rebel against God. As they may be struggling to see their own sins, I think it's the last two verses in Psalm. I believe it's 23 or Psalm 139. I believe it's verse 23 and 24. But it says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there be any wicked in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." It's one of the most beautiful prayers that I've seen, and I try to pray on a regular basis, and I tell them to pray this on a regular basis, so that way they can grow in knowing what their sin is and how to overcome it. The next question, number 11, this is probably going to sound a little bit more familiar to them. We just started in a series called What is Sin at youth group, so hopefully they'll be able to answer this and have a little bit more comfortable understanding for conversation's sake. Anyways, sin is loving anything more than God. It is thinking, speaking, or acting in ways that are against God's will for us. That sounds a little complex. I think another answer they might feel more knowledge of is transgressions of God's law, the things that He has said to do. 1 John verses 3 and 4 talk about. Deuteronomy 9:7 and Joshua 1:8 talk about how sin is rebellion against God's law. So as we look at that, when we look at the idea of loving anything more than God, it means we're choosing that over God's ways. And that's how we understand this idea of loving anything more than God. Because at lip service, most people would say they love God more than anything. But in practice, it typically leads to us rebellion against God's law. And so being able to walk with them through, it's not just saying we love God more, but it's showing that we love God more. Another good concept to teach them here when we're talking about sin is the sin of omission versus sin of commission. See, when we have the sin of commission, it's really easy to understand. It's when we do a sin, when we actually steal something, or we lie, or we gossip, or we do the action. A sin of omission is when we know the right thing to do and we choose not to do it. We omit that detail. We skip over that. We say, nope, not going to worry about that because it's not my problem, or it's what I feel like I'm supposed to do, but I really don't want to, so I'm choosing not to do it. There is a sin of omission. I think that's an important concept to get to, and I actually didn't cover that in youth already, so that would be a great spot to be able to bring that up and jump in it with them. There's also, if you've been in the Christian sphere for a long time, you could go with this idea of inherent sin or original sin, imputed sin, and personal sin, but I think some of those is getting a little bit more complex, but it is a good spot to go to. So the idea of original sin is sin was passed on to us because Adam and Eve sinned, therefore all of humanity enters into this idea of sin with them. Imputed sin, I mean, we walk constantly in that state, like we cannot help but sin because there was I believe that's where we had a transformation happen that created us to just be inherently sinful. And then personal sin is the actual sins we create. So we are by nature born into sin, and we by nature sin. So there's just no way around it that we're going to be sinning. And so that's why Romans 3:23 comes to mind, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's no one who's without this because we live in a state of sin. Sorry, I got excited on sharing those things. Back over on track here with the statement says, love begins with desire. Sometimes, though, because of sin, desire can become tainted. When this happens, our desire can interfere with our trust, love, and desire for God. So we have to really be guarded on what we love and what we pour ourselves into. What are some things that you have loved more than God? Hopefully this will transfer over also from some of that conversation that you guys had about what's some of the bait that pulls us away from the Lord and the things that He teaches us. And then I would encourage you in that conversation to continue. What does the world say? Are these things more important than God? And trying to help them understand, how does culture look at what their decisions are to follow after God or to follow after the things of this world. Everyone who sins is breaking God's law, for all sin is contrary to the law of God. 1 John 3:4. That's where it comes in. Hopefully you guys looked at it before. And then I would encourage you guys just to have the conversation with them, like, what is the mindset when we choose to sin? What are we tend to have in our head? Is it justifying that it's okay to sin? Is it saying that we just don't care and want to do what we want to do? Is it a rebellious heart? I'd encourage them to kind of start thinking about that. What is in their frame of mind when they choose to sin? I'm going to be praying for you guys through this. This is going to be a great conversation. The next one, as we'll look at verses 12 and 13, how are we affected by sin and what is the lasting consequence of sin? Hopefully those will also be familiar, because I'll be ahead of you guys maybe in some of our youth group times talking about it. But I think you guys will have a great time, and it should be some easy conversation, because as we've gone through this, they've been able to catch and say, you know what, we definitely see sin in the world. So this is nothing new, but something that they can really understand and see. So have a blessed time, and please let me know how it goes.